So, just to refresh where we left off yesterday, and of course, this book is about the Office of Public Safety, Dan Mederone, and we've covered kind of his beginnings in Richmond, Indiana, and now we're on his assignment to Brazil after he's resigned. And we have SR. Can you mute your mic?
I am sorry.
That's okay. And we left off with Lincoln Gordon, who was kind of the odd man out in the new administration. And he was thinking with JFK in office that he was going to get one of his top three choices, which he didn't, but they're going to make him the ambassador to Brazil. And we also had introduced the Brazilian president, dictator, Vargas, Vargas, and how basically he was a big fan of the United States. He had sent a regiment to uh, fight against the Axis government in Italy, and that's kind of where we left off. So Vargas had first come to power in Brazil in 1930. He had been the beneficiary of a popular revolution led by coffee growers protesting a drop in the world coffee prices. He formed a military coalition that challenged the industrial power of the kind of the big people in Brazil at the time. And he had ousted the elected president and basically became a dictator. FDR, who came to office 3 years after Vargas had taken over, found him to be a great ally of the United States and had helped with a lot of the US oligarchs to begin a program of deficit spending in order to counter the depression that was going on at the time. There was a lot of parallels between the personal life of Vargas and that of his new friends in Washington. The meaning FDR. The dictator had experienced a accident early in his life that left his legs crushed in a car accident. He married later in life, and between his wife, Donna Darcy, and him, they had 5 different kids. But he also liked browsing around with people he wasn't married to. The FDR and Vargas communicated with each other often. And also, they kind of ganged up on Charles de Gaulle over in France, and that left the French leader not liking either one of them. In 1938, the Mexican government had nationalized the U.S. oil companies, and the oil executives had appealed to Washington to bring in basically the military to overthrow the Mexican government. And one author pointed out, quote, "The whole principle behind intervention by the U.S. is that when one of your citizens buys property in a foreign land, that property is no longer subject to the local foreign land government." The response of the Roosevelt administration had been very legalistic, only assisting in negotiating long-term settlements. Given that background, Vargas might have appropriated the Brazilian utilities owned by U.S. corporations, but he did not do that. He was determined to basically be a vassal of the investors from the United States. During his 15-year reign, Vargas faced a number of armed challenges. The middle class absolutely despised him. Vargas responded by banning the local Communist Party, which again is analogous to the workers' rights movements throughout Latin America, because it was the only alternative to the dictators. They tried unsuccessfully to storm the presidential palace, and basically during this period of time, Vargas was locking up a lot of the people that were interested in workers' rights. For Brazil industrial workers, Vargas years were marked by hope that they could work with the government to gain some type of recognition despite what was going on. Because the dictator, to placate the masses, instituted Social Security programs and attempted to get behind some of the least militant labor movements. However, Vargas's labor ministry did some good things, but they also did some bad things. So they implemented an 8-hour a day work requirement. They banned children workers under the age of 14, and they promoted women in the workforce. The dictator had even forbidden newspapers to print the word democracy. You are not allowed, if you owned a newspaper, to talk about democracy. The end of the World War II basically emboldened the people of Brazil to begin talking about World War II, or excuse me, democracy again. The officer corps that had installed Vargas now wanted to put him out and call for elections. Democracy had returned to Brazil, but only by the grace of the army. Once again, the generals showed that they took seriously their right inherited from their ancestry to be in control. Literacy laws prevented Brazil's majority from voting, which was basically the underclass. 3 major political parties sprung up. The most popular was a conservative alliance. It had been formed for the most part by industrialists and landowners. You know, that elite class that the US oligarchs likes to cultivate in order to control the population. The next most populist movement, political party, if you will, the National Democratic Union, which basically made up the largest segment of the middle class. There was also a workers' party with a name I'm not going to be able to pronounce, but we're just going to call it the Workers' Party. The Brazilian Communist Party was legalized as a 4th party, but just temporarily. In 1947, it was outlawed again by the Brazilian government. The landowners in the Social Democrats and the Workers' Party each owed debts to Vargas, and they entered into a coalition to gain strength until by 1950, the old dictator could assume the presidency again. That was his plan. He planned to kind of galvanize support and then come back into the presidency. Vargas soon found out it was harder to govern that way. Without restrictions on the press, he had to bear daily onslaughts from his opponents. And a young journalist by the name of Carlos Lacerda um, began criticizing him quite frequently in the media. Lasarda increased his attacks until it became impossible for Vargas and his loyal friends to bear them. One night in August 1954, an army friend of Lasarda's was murdered in front of his apartment building. The evidence implicated one of Vargas's security men called the Black Angels of Death. The uproar that followed basically made Lusarda a kind of like a living martyr for his friend. Vargas saw that he could not continue as president and he retired. A few days later, he committed suicide. Behind, he left a remarkable document, bold and pleading, in which he blamed outside forces for helping create the circumstances that killed him. The foreign countries made profits of up to 500%. So he's basically tattletelling. They demonstrably deprived the state of more than $100 million by falsely inflating the evaluations of goods that were being imported into Brazil. Vargas was acting under a long cultural code of honor, basically coming clean. He ended his message saying, "Sincerely, I take the first step on the road to eternity, and I leave life to enter history." After a short period of what the heck are we going to do, a politician by the name of Kubitschek took over the presidency in 1955 and was confronted by another period of rising inflation and falling coffee prices. Every penny dropped in the world's price of coffee meant Brazil's treasury lost $25 million. Kubitschek sought to convince foreign capitalists to invest in Brazil by offering concessions that neither Vargas nor Franklin Roosevelt might have approved. The new president canceled the ceilings on profits and allowed foreign investors to take their profits home. Prior to that, they had required them to reinvest them in the local economy, at least a portion of them, depending on which guy was in charge. Factory equipment could come into Brazil untaxed. When a foreign investor launched a company, no percentage of Brazilian participation was even required. They didn't have to hire local people. By 1959, the U.S. Department of Commerce was reporting that the investment climate in Brazil was one of the most favorable in the world. So basically, he was giving away the store. Brazil paid heavily for this expression of confidence. One local economist calculated that his regime had given away the equivalent of $1 billion to foreign firms through tax credits and assistance in relocating or locating a production company to Brazil. Now, what this author doesn't go into is Nelson Rockefeller's role in all of this. And in the book that I read about Nelson Rockefeller, this is when, especially on the farming end of this, because obviously coffee's a big deal and agriculture was a big deal in Brazil, all of the big corporations in the United States began flooding into Brazil during this period of time, setting up and in large part taking over a large segment of the Brazilian economy. In another study, the privileges extended to the new automobile industry to include Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, General Motors, and Ford were shown to equal Brazil's national budget. So Germany and the US flooded into Brazil. In those same years of the late 1950s, Kubitschek's ministers cut off support to the National Motor Company, which was their only indigenous car manufacturer. To some Brazilians, The foreign aid program of the Eisenhower years and even the Alliance for Progress was a sham, so long as 5 times more dollars were leaving Brazil in the form of earnings, dividends, and royalties than were entering the country as direct new investments. The men nationalist joked that it was Brazil that was giving foreign aid to the United States as a result of that. It was undeniable that the infusion of capital, that the nation of Brazil was booming, but who was getting the profits? For generations, popular wisdom had held that Brazil would never be a great nation so long as it remained a collection of coastal cities with a jungle at their backs. No one questioned that Rio was a hindrance to hard work. And it starts talking about some kind of local things that the bus line in their coastal cities wouldn't even run within a certain distance of the beach because workers would just get off the bus and go to the beach instead of going to work. And the author kind of describes all of that. As the elections approached, there was another difficulty. Brazilians' electoral laws did not permit a president to succeed himself, nor were presidential candidates empowered to pick their running mate. They did what the US used to do. The 2 highest vote getters became the president and vice president, regardless of party. You know, back when we didn't have a 2-party system that everybody insists that we have to have today. A rancher from the south of Brazil by the name of Jorge Goulart. His name is Goulart, however you pronounce that. Goulart, that's the way I'm going to pronounce it. Goulart had been so cherished by Vargas that rumors spread that he was the dictator's illegitimate son. Even in the largest nominally Catholic land on earth, suicide had only enhanced Vargas's standing. In Washington, it was clear and displeasing that Goulart might win the next election. The problem was ideological. As Vargas's Minister of Labor, Goulart had been credited with the regime's reforms. Some U.S. intelligence reports found him perilously close to communist. That's what the CIA was telling everybody. You know, because if you support labor reforms from the U.S. oligarchs, you are automatically labeled a communist. Washington rated the other major contender, Jânio Quadros, nearly as susceptible to that leaning. Between the 2 imperfect options, they obviously, to include the U.S. Embassy staff, wanted Quadros to be the next president. Throughout his term as governor, Quadros had won the affection of working men. Now he was campaigning for president. 48% of the Brazilian voters believed in basically his message. The largest majority vote in Brazil's history. Once again, Goulart was elected vice president on the labor ticket. On taking office, Quadros swung his rigid broom erratically. He sharply devalued the Brazilian currency, which really pleased the U.S. oligarchs. In a campaign to restore morality to Brazil, he banned bikinis from the beach. A recent trip around the world had convinced Quadros the third world countries should move to a middle ground between capitalist and communist and remain neutral. That, you know, is a kiss of death. You're not allowed to be neutral in this Operation Gladio story. Public opinion polls seem to support him. One survey showed 63% of Brazilians preferred neutrality. The polls also showed that the higher a person's income, the more friendly they were to the US. Imagine that. Quadros met complaints about his shift to the political center by saying that his foreign policy had grown up. As criticism from the press grew, Quadros sequestered himself in the presidential palace. He lacked the political acumen to build a bridge to the different coalitions. When Ernesto Che Guevara went to Uruguay for a conference of the Organization of American States, Quadros invited him to stop in Brazil. At the conference in a sea resort in Uruguay, Richard Goodwin, who had promised to end the economic disparity between the Americas, we talked about him yesterday or the day before, met the man sworn to hold Goodwin to that promise. By the time the conference arrived, relations between the U.S. and Cuba had reached a new low. 4 months earlier, Washington had just tried to overthrow the Castro government. Consequently, Goodwin was not expecting to receive in his hotel room a mahogany box inlaid with a Cuban seal of their prized cigars. The note accompanying the cigars read, "Since I have no greeting card, I have to write. Since I have to write to an enemy is difficult, I limit myself to extending my hand." That note was from Fidel Castro, and the box of cigars was meant for JFK. Goodwin brought the cigars back to the White House and offered them to the president, who opened the box and took one out and started smoking one. Goodwin would later write that President Kennedy said of the incident that he probably should have made Goodwin smoke one first in case they blew up after they had just tried to overthrow the Cuban government. Goodwin, the whole iteration of this was that Goodwin had actually met with Che Guevara. According to Goodwin, Che Guevara warned him that there would be either a leftist revolution or a rightist coup leading to leftist takeover, and that there was a strong chance that in some countries the worker party would come to power through popular elections. Writing 2 years before the election of Salvador Allende in Chile, Goodwin added, "None of this has come to pass." Well, they're not going to ever allow that through any opportunity that they have, because they destabilize countries first. In the off chance that one of the people they don't want in office gets elected, they just assassinate them. Che Guevara put forth a number of suggestions to ease relationships to Goodwin, according to him, including a promise to pay for U.S. property in Cuba that had been expropriated. It was not an intractable foe of the U.S. who left the conference and stopped in Brazil. So Che Guevara was there to offer an olive branch to Goodwin and a message to JFK. During Che Guevara's visit, Quadros confirmed his grown-up, independent policy by presenting Che Guevara with Brazil's highest award for foreigners. In Che Guevara's life, it may have been only a minor honor, but to Carlos Lacerda, the presentation was an affront to Brazil and a splendid opportunity for him to write a fiery rant about it. He went on air and accused the Quadros Ministry of Justice of preparing a coup that would give Quadros great expanded powers. "The man we elected doesn't want to be president," Lacerda said to his audience. "He wants to be a dictator." Lacerda spoke on a Thursday, when Quadros made his move at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, he might have expected that the weekend would give the nation time to rally behind him. Whatever his thinking, Quadros resigned the presidency. His message had echoes of Vargas's suicide note. Here's a quote from his message. I feel crushed. Terrible forces have risen against me. I want Brazil for Brazilians. I confronted in that battle of corruption, lies, and cowardice, which subordinated general interests to the appetite of a small group of ambitious individuals, including ones from abroad. Quadros was to learn that committing political suicide didn't make you the martyr that actually committing suicide did. Both men had denounced the interest arrayed against them. But in Quadros's case, rival politicians joked that while they could not identify the domestic interests, the foreign ones were Haig and Haig's teacher, Johnny Walker. Signs of support for Quadros were few. Several labor leaders urged him to return to office. A crowd understood his references to foreign influence well enough to stone the U.S. Embassy. But the military moved to place Quadros under guard, which stopped him from making any other speeches. He would later ask, where are the 6 million people in Brazil who voted for me? Whether cunningly or not, before resigning, Quadros had dispatched his vice president on a goodwill tour of China. So he's obviously trying to paint his vice president as a communist as well, because he was from the opposing party. Now it fell upon the military to decide what was going to happen, whether they were going to let Juilliard, freshly contaminated from his communist exposure, return and assume presidency, which is what the Constitution required. The Ministry of War, a guy by the name of Odilio Diaz, said Goulart should not take office. The ministers of the various military services agreed with him. At this point, the provisional president, Pascal Renari Mazzelli, told Congress of the military decision and proposed legislation to keep Goulart from assuming office. There was a precedent for such a law, but Goulart, way around the world, had a potent ally in his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Leonard Brizola, who was the governor of Rio Grande do Sul. No one, least of all Brizola, would deny that he was the man of the labor movement. At the conference, he had urged Brazil to side with the Alliance for Progress, but as governor, he could bring pressure on the commander of the Third Army stationed in his area. There could easily have been a civil war. Goulart's enemies claimed that he had put communists into sensitive labor jobs. But the real threat to the army, to the industrialists, and to the foreign investors was the likelihood that Goulart's organized labor would become the dominant force in Brazilian politics. In neighboring Argentina, Juan Perón had shown even better that Vargas, how sturdy a base of shirtless ones could provide for an ambitious politician. After 10 days of uncertainty, Congress passed an amendment that reformed the parliamentary model. Goulart, awaiting in Paris to hear his fate, would be allowed to come back and be president, but his powers was going to be more of a prime minister than as actual president. When the military indicated that the compromise was fine, Goulart flew back to Brazil. That was a face-saving solution that circumvented the more difficult challenge ahead. The army was credited with showing restraint and devotion for democratic principles when all the episode proved was that the plotters against Goulart was as strong enough, wasn't strong yet enough to resist him. Goulart accepted the compromise, although he didn't like it, and proceeded home. Not surprisingly, the uproar clouded Lincoln Gordon's pleasure in his appointment as ambassador. President Kennedy had sent his name to the U.S. Senate one day before Quadros resigned. So he's going to arrive into a hot mess. Loren Gowen, usually called Jack, appreciated early in his tour of Latin America just how crucial it was for a police advisor to be simpatico. Very likely it was a quality of the heart, and no one could set out to learn it. You just had to have it. But if a foreigner made an effort to be kind and soft edged, Latin America broadened their definition of the word simpatico. Before coming to Brazil early in 1960, Gowen had set up the first police advisory team in Indonesia and served on the advisory team in Turkey. Before that, he had directed a crime lab in Pittsburgh. It was this varied background that led Byron Engel to send him to Rio as an advisor and to conduct investigations. Gowen's work took him to the state of Minas Gerais, where he could evaluate an advisor in Brazil. They had long discussions about the job, and Gowen was able to caution Mitterrand against several pitfalls. Gowen had seen men isolate themselves in U.S. embassy compounds, spending their off-duty time exclusively with Americans. Such advisors didn't last long in Engel's program. And remember, Engels is the guy that's running the Office of Public Safety. Mitterrand would heed that message. He was eager to make good because he had uprooted his entire family and moved them to Brazil. But even if he had not been ambitious, he would have found little reason to seek out his compatriots. Those from the State Department often shared their superiors' opinion that the police program didn't belong in the foreign aid area. And in some cases, some of the people on the embassy staff didn't like the program at all. Others from the CIA, whom the police advisors might have expected to be natural allies, oftentimes treated them, even though they were basically running the program, as kind of the JV team. Sometimes the distinction between the CIA and the police advisors was contentious. Arriving in 1960, a guy by the name of Maurice Calfee, Calfee, a retired officer from the LAPD, was immediately set straight about the limits of his duties. He was told to stay away from the military police. The CIA was working with them directly. He should deal exclusively with the national and local police. But in Brazil, the police ministar, despite its name, was the main law enforcement body in the civilian sector. Calfee understood that he was being shut out from any meaningful work that he thought he was supposed to be doing there, and he eventually resigned in 2 years. The attitude of the natives was entirely different. Not only were their traditions hospitable, but they could profit materially from the hearty friendship of their advisors. The Yankees, as they called them, brought a cornucopia of equipment to lavish upon them, and they loved their new toys. Just reading through the catalogs about radios and radars and fingerprinting kits could make a police lieutenant ecstatic with the thought that he was going to be empowered with all these new tools. A strain of inferiority ran through Latin American police departments, especially those in Brazil. Pay was low, nepotism was taken for granted, and prestige was non existent. Young Brazilians had a saying: if you're too clumsy to be a soccer player and too stupid to get into the university and too ugly to play in a rock band, you join the police. That's quite a pecking order. Brazilian officials acknowledged that their patrolmen were not top quality. They could not help teasing the powerful North Americans who came to improve their performance. Sometimes it even seemed that the US advisors were the pupils and they were being measured continually against the ethic of the host country. Who could be tougher? Who could be more intelligent? A few years later, thousands of US lieutenants and captains faced the same judging process in South Vietnam. Jack Goyen was warned Jack Gowen had warned Mitterrand of the police hazing that he would receive. To minimize mistakes, Mitterrand conducted official business through an interpreter, a 19-year-old student by the name of Ricard Pedro Newbert. To Ricard, everything about the Mitterrand family was attractive, particularly their two teenage daughters, but he knew his station and never approached either. Other young people was also drawn to the Mitterrand household. At first, they could not see past Mitterrand's imposing bulk, his big cigars, and they called him the Mafia Chief. Once he ceased to scare them, they hung around the house often. Ricard had found that house clean and pretty. The yard was surrounded by a low wall with an iron railing, which was for decoration, not security. Very few Brazilians knew that the US had sent a police chief to their country, and those aware of Mitterrand's presence were friendly for the most part. Set near the top of a hill, the house had been faced with blue and cream colored tiles. It was immaculate, it was beautiful. Yet Hank Mitterrand, Dan Mitterrand's wife, was not always happy to be there. Buying meat at an outdoor stall did not meet with her standards. Running the drinking water through a charcoal filter was a nuisance. She was not always silent about these discomforts. To Brazilians who believed the price for peace was never too high, her complaints fell on deaf ears. Only once did an outsider hear Dan Mitterrand say, quote, in the States, I couldn't make $15,000 a year and you couldn't have two maids. Here we can, unquote. At the office, Mitterrand's routine ran smoothly. His duties were to assist the police of the state and making investigations more scientific to improve communications, create a police academy, etc. In Brazil, with its history of military takeovers, the civil police were under the wing of the army. Their commander was a political appointee, generally a career army colonel. So the police in Brazil was not an independent body from the army, despite what most people think. Back home, Mitterrand had seen the effect of the Republican Party stranglehold on the police. It became his announced creed that in Brazil, policemen must be apolitical, and he expounded upon that to the Brazilians. Mitterrand himself could not at all times meet his own high standards. In the police laboratory, there worked a Brazilian chemist who, if not formerly a socialist, he believed that Brazilians' wealth had to be radically redistributed from the oligarchs to the middle class. Conversations like that left Mitterrand infuriated. Although he had learned to harness his temper, once back in his own office, he would stew over these exchanges. Dealing with Richmond's city government had taught him to extract increased funding for his department, and the off-duty time for him and his officers were used for professional development. In Brazil, He tried to impart those qualities to the policemen. The Brazilian police, however, didn't care about any of that. They just wanted their new toys. There was over $100,000 worth of expensive cameras, projectors, screens, fingerprinting kits, and photography equipment that was flown in. At the FBI Academy, Dan had acquired an enthusiasm for practice shooting. Now the USAID program was sending targets and ammunition for him to pursue. For crime scene training, there were kits of tools and bags for taking soil, wood slivers, and all kinds of different things. The traffic department first received simple gear such as tubes to lay in the street to measure speed. Within a few months, Mutaron had produced for them electronic equipment and radios for each of the police cars. There was not much that could be done for the cop on the beat. He still had to call headquarters from a public phone at the time he got there. Mutaron had kept his faith in the value of appearances when the police received new uniforms. He considered the news worth writing home about. He had been sending occasional letters to the local paper in Richmond that could be converted into news stories, a way of keeping his name alive in Richmond because he wanted to return there. Now he told the folks at home that in their new uniforms, they look like Richmond's finest. He also added, our public relations program includes changing the traffic uniforms from a plain sackcloth to blue, made of better material. The public will have more respect for the police if they look good. And of course, looks to Dan Mutaron, as we discovered early on in the story, was very, very important. Other advisors very occasionally lured Mutaron out to explore the local nightlife, but left him to himself generally. Though Hank now had maids, she was one of the rare U.S. wives that did not take on a Brazilian cook. This was the result of her desire to do her own. In Richmond, she had mastered many different dishes inherited from Dan's mother. As a result, Mutaron was getting, he was gaining a lot of weight. To his Brazilian host, he remained the model of professional behavior, a Democrat who never failed to greet elevator operators by name and attend Sunday Mass. Oscar Niedermeyer, the architect who designed Brasilia, had begun his career in the local area where Dan was stationed. And Niedermeyer had basically made that entire area very nice. About the same time, political tensions were rising elsewhere, unnoticed by Mutaron, who did not read the local papers. In the fall of 1961, a division commander of Brazil's First Army gave a speech nearby before a conference of the state's commercial association. Although the First Army was based in Rio, its 4th Division made its headquarters in the local area where Dan was. The meeting of businessmen and factory owners had been underwritten by a chain of newspapers in the area. Their publisher, Chateaubriand, was being given funds by the CIA to promote propaganda in the local area. Predictably, Pinheiro Bly gave a strictly what they labeled as anti-communist, but it was really anti-labor movement. But its partnership went beyond even what a conservative audience expected to hear publicly from a general on active duty. Bly blamed communist and labor parties from penetrating every level of Brazilian society and said that they posed a serious threat to democracy. That sounds so familiar, almost, like the CIA's writing it. A young socialist, Jose Rebelo, published a weekly paper in the same area. It was called Two Names. Intrigued by the coverage given the speech, The leading newspaper of the chain sponsoring the conference, Robella assigned a reporting team to check the general's background because they wanted to ensure this was actually kind of a challenge to free speech at the time. Robello's police reporters for a time was Fernando Gabrero, a 19-year-old from the provinces who was using the local area Dan was in as a way station on the road to a newspaper career in Rio. As a boy, Fernando had watched the men in his town who owned small looms forced out of business by textile corporations from the US. One by one, the men had sold all of their tools to go work in the US factories. Sometimes they were able to get higher pay. Always, the police took the side of the mill owners. In high school, one of Fernando's teachers had mused aloud about how it happened that some men who were very rich and other men who were very poor. But if you were to put all of them on an island, the teacher said, the same men would become rich again because they worked hard. The poor were just lazy. Fernando had raised his hand and said, I can only say that in my town, the very poor work very hard. That was basically the shared attitude of the Labor Party in the area. And the reporters sent to investigate the general undertook the task with glee. Among other things, they found that in the early stages of World War II, he had been active in a fascist movement. They published the details of his background, including the fact that as governor of the state of Espírito Santo, he had constructed concentration camps for his political enemies, the liberals and the anti-Nazis. The dispatch was headed, this is the name of the article, Who is the General Polero Bly? A Democrat today, a fascist yesterday. Soon after the story appeared, the general rang Robello and demanded to see him. You have published an article injurious to me. The affair must be resolved, the general said. Robello agreed to meet him. General Bly arrived within an hour. Robello had prepared some remarks on the freedom of speech. The general interrupted him and said, I don't want an explanation. I've come to give you a lesson. With that, he bolted across the desk and grabbed him by the neck. The general, at 53, was a bull of a man. He seemed to expect that the 24-year-old editor with glasses and an intellectual would be intimidated. Instead, when the general threw a punch, Robello returned it, blackening his eye and cutting his lip. The general had left an aide in the hall. Now alerted to the turmoil in the office, the captain burst in, followed by Robello's editorial staff. All of them became witness to Bly's injuries. Worse still, the presence of photographers guaranteed the general's wounds would be on the front page of every newspaper. More cursing followed and more shouts. When Polero Bly finally retreated, Robello called the police. He wanted to be sure that they understood that the general had been the aggressor. He had not been reassured to hear the captain vowing to lead, as he led his bloodied superior to the elevator. This is going to continue, the captain promised. It took about 2 hours before 300 junior officers from the army barracks surrounded the block and stopped traffic in every direction. Shock troops raced up the stairs, threw open the door, and set about destroying the office. It was nearly Christmas. They ground the staff Christmas tree into the floor. Then the typewriters were demolished. They broke the toilets, and outside the street, bazookas had been set up near with machine gun installations. The entire military action took 2 hours. The governor, an elderly conservative politician, wanted to avoid the showdown with the army, but he did promise that the staff, that the police would protect them from further reprisal. The damage had ran about $150,000, but Robello knew that he could never win a judgment against the general or the troops. However, he had one ally who proved better protection than a pledge from the governor. Shortly before the episode, Goulart had unexpectedly become president. When any Brazilian president spoke, especially Goulart, he could he could not take for granted that the nation's generals would heed him. Still, he decided to move against Bligh. To punish the general's abuse of power, Golart transferred him to a less prestigious post and somehow made the demotion stick. Bligh chose instead to take an early retirement. For the leftists, the affair had been an ugly reminder of the hostility the military felt towards them. Yet there was one redeeming aspect. Brazil was still a democracy, and Brazil's president still had the ability to act. When a team of undergraduate scientists journeyed to the area, Dan Mitterrand was already deep in his efforts to improve the local police force. The students composed another sort of advisory mission. They wanted to find ways to make the state's iron ore deposits, the largest in the world, profitable for Brazil. One team member was a small, wavy-haired student by the name of Marcos Adruda. He was enrolled in the School of Geology in Rio de Janeiro. Marcos did not look like a revolutionary or a martyr, and he certainly during the years of Golart's regime, he was questioning of Brazil's social order. For example, Marcos and some friends mentioned to the director of their school that because geology courses always ran from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., poor students who had to work couldn't go. Yes, agreed the director, it's an elitist school, but geologists must be cultured. They must have money enough to travel. You talk about the poor, the director said. They are good for nothing, consuming and never producing. They should jump from the hills and kill themselves. That's a nice sentiment. But Leonardo's said, geology has nothing to do with politics. Our role is to go up in the hills and see how beautiful the earth is. Lofty words, but to Marcos, not inspiring, nor could he quite accept the distinction the director was drawing between geology and politics. Leonardo's was both a member of the commission within the Ministry of Education that laid down policy for teaching geology throughout Brazil. What was he to make of this? When Metrobras, the federal petroleum company, offered the school 2 scholarships, Leonardo's made the selection and gave one grant to the son of a general and the other to a son of Brazil's vice president. Once again, a student delegation called on the director and asked why he had chosen those as recipients. They'd need money too, the director replied. The answer drove Marcos into student politics. He joined his classmates in making independent mining studies, and by the time they traveled to Minas Gerais, they had uncovered some troubling statistics. 97.3% of Brazil's iron ore was being mined by companies controlled by the U.S. There was Hana Mining, U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel. From Germany, there was Mansman, and from Belgium, Belgomera. In Minas Gerais, Marco's assignment was to survey the iron ore deposit. At first look, the ownership of Minas belied the earlier findings, for the bulk of the deposits belonged to the Brazilian municipal company. Probing deeper, Marcos and his team discovered that the best ore, the ore in the middle layers, had been brought up by Hana, the U.S. company. And for the past 10 years, the U.S. had been sending geologists to the region. During the same period, the foreign companies were bidding on concessions. Hana had selected areas that the Brazilian government seldom visited, areas not known to contain ore at all. When the survey was finally released, it turned out that Hana controlled the choicest deposits. Marcos could only conclude that the U.S. companies had enjoyed access to surveys in progress while the Brazilian government had not had them shared with them. Armed with these findings, Marcos and other students campaigned for a state monopoly like Petrobras to be called Mineral Boss. It would mine the nation's ore for the good of all people, even in the Golart era. That sounded radical. It was true that the group included 2 or 3 members of the Labor Party, but that matter, Marcos said, didn't matter to him. It was what was best for the Brazilian people. So you see where we're going with this. Now, what's important about this and tying some of our other readings into this is the a long time ago we talked about this. Nelson Rockefeller, again, of course, they had, under the guise of various other things, been mapping all of Brazil, all of Latin America. They had planes down there that mapped out everything. And that information, although we paid for it as US tax dollars, was given because it was ran out of an office under FDR. That information was given to US corporations. It's like intelligence. And they used it to exploit the resources. And in the case that he just articulated, in case you didn't get all of that, he is saying that the US corporations knew of deposits that were not shared with the Brazilian government. And they were mining of the deposits that they knew about. They were mining the best part of those mines, but they were also mining mines that had never even been declared to the Brazilian government. And this group of students doing this survey had discovered this. And it's about to get dicey. So that's it for today.
Well, just that's all. I mean, oh my God. And the document, how well documented this is, the coup and CIA's involvement in the coup is just overwhelming.
Yeah. It is very interesting. And this book does have a lot of details that were not available to me in any of the other research that I had done, which is why when I got the book, I knew immediately that we had to go through it. Not just of Dan Mitarone's story, but of the Office of Public Safety, the CIA's involvement, and it maps better than most of the books, although we generically know all of this, that the US oligarchs are behind all of this in order to exploit resources. It does a very good job within the country of Brazil of the people on the ground actively trying to resist it and the affront of them by their government, and the few people like Golart that will fight back against it are immediately attacked by this monstrosity called the United States, and the elements of power that it brings to bear. Obviously, I don't think you would find most Americans, and I hate people that speak for most Americans, but no one I know would be against Brazil processing their own iron ore and enriching their own people as a result of that and selling that product, whether it be steel or whatever, on the market under a free trade environment. But that's never allowed to happen. You have these big, for lack of a better word, monsters that are behind the curtain. And I love the fact that this book names names of all of the corporations, because I'm all about that. I want everybody to understand the corporate entities, many of them headquartered in the United States, but as we saw, Belgium and Germany, all involved in this as well, are kind of the people behind the curtain that no one ever talks about. And they are the ones, as we've proven unequivocally, that the CIA works on behalf of to create the instability and a climate in which they can extort local countries of their natural resources. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. And
and thank everybody for attending Spaces today in Rumble. I guess what I'm looking at today, and just what we covered today, and Dan Mediron and what was really going on. We covered Mexico. We covered Cuba. Che Guevara gets involved. We covered Uruguay and Brazil, all in one day. It just, you can't make this stuff up.
Well, and interestingly enough, you see how it intertwines. Just today in our Secret Society show, we were talking about the Carnegies, which turns into U.S. Steel, right? So all of it comes full circle. It's all intricately woven together. And that's why Maker Sarge over on Rumble, U.S. Steel, Carnegie. Yes, Maker Sarge, you're absolutely right. Thank you for paying attention. They are intimately involved in this entire thing. You can't, and that's why I think it's hilarious that these people think that, there's only one thing, Jeffrey Epstein. Oh my God, we got to get it, Jeffrey Epstein. This thing is so huge. And all of you know that. All of you understand that this is 100 years in the making, if not longer, and that this post-World War II apparatus that has been set up to do this covertly through the use of stay-behinds and the CIA and the State Department, as we learned today, the Carnegie Foundation for Peace was said in its very first couple of years that they would basically control everything by controlling the State Department. And you're basically trying to take down this entire colossal structure and not kill a whole bunch of people at the same time. So, or create civil war. And I find it entertaining to listen to people. Not that we don't want people held accountable, but it's not going to happen in a couple of months. All along?
All right, Carl, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. So your mentioning of Nelson Rockefeller's role in Brazil is, is very important. Nelson is somebody who basically, U.S. academics and journalists just cannot write about it because there's like three Nelson Rockefellers: the governor, the guy running the foundations with, profound impact on the history of U.S. medical care, and the philanthropy to the academics. And then there's also the presidential candidate. It's just like he's all over this, and the money is so deep and so foundational to academics. They can't write about it, and it's that's why I think it's kind of funny to remember RFK's visit to Peru in 1965, and he was dealing with similar issues as in Brazil, with mining rights and oil rights, and U.S. imperialist corporations going in and taking this stuff and resisting all efforts, as you mentioned earlier, by the guy whose name begins with K and the guy whose name begins with Q, who I call Goulart, or I might be mixing up with the guy whose name begins with G.
Goulart.
So, but yeah, Goulart, and they were to some extent too nationalist, economic nationalists for Wall Street and the Rockefeller, gang, as it were, who want to seem all internationalist and lovey-dovey, can't we all get along, but are just manipulating that internationalist image for craven, imperialist corporate means against the populations, both in the United States and abroad, as we see right now in, the genocide in Israel. And, but RFK jokes to the Peruvian students, we Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast. And I'm like, if that doesn't prove Nelson Rockefeller's dyslexia once and for all, that was it. I mean, Nelson had dyslexia. What are we going to do? But he's also, I just wanted to mention, some of the key differences between the elite versus JFK's Alliance for Progress. Generally people are in agreement that the Alliance of Progress did not work. That's pretty much beyond debate. But the disagreement is why it didn't work. And basically, I think I'm convinced by the argument that it was a boycott of capital, meaning the boycott of Wall Street refusing to go along with the Alliance for Progress. And the primary reason was because JFK wanted that to go through the Brazilian elected government of Goulart. But Nelson Rockefeller and his peeps, who organized the Brazil coup, they were already doing it as early as 62 with the two biggest Brazilian governors behind the back of Goulart. They wanted direct investment by U.S. International corporations into Brazil without passing through the Brazilian government. So there's no electoral influence on that corporate imperialism in the sort favored by Nelson and his glorious internationalists that are ruling our utopia today. And that's a key difference between Rockefeller's vision for Brazil, where he had incredible, as you know, influence from Thy Will Be Done, which goes into that extensively, and all South America, versus JFK's Alliance for Progress. One, offered, in the opinion of the U.S. elites who are ruling us today in the form of the CIA, JFK's vision offered too much input for voters, in the sense of both Goulart and the guy whose name begins with K were, seen as two economic nationalists for Wall Street and the CIA.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. There's an article on Duke University's website that talks about Rockefeller's role in Brazil in bringing basically genetically modified seeds and creating a rural extension service. And I mentioned that one of the efforts was by International Harvester. He basically set up like these packages to create, the only word I can think of to say it that makes kind of a common words is like indentured servants. They would go into farming communities and basically sell them this package of modern farming equipment, genetically modified seeds, and then basically they had an arrangement where they would purchase a certain amount of the product from it, and it made them all make them dependent upon the US for spare parts and new equipment and all of this other stuff. And it basically just overthrew all of their rural agricultural products. And as we saw, what happened in Iran was something very similar to that. After they overthrow Mossadegh, they did exactly the same thing. They went in and basically made Iran was like the breadbasket of that area because of their rural farming, and they had such rich soil that they overproduced and exported goods all over the region. That was true with Brazil as well. But what happened was these companies, once they used these packages and then they extorted the people to pay them back for them. They then got to decide what was going to be planted. And so no longer was Iran or Brazil producing all of the food for that country. They were producing specialized things, and because they were using so much of the farmland to do these specific products, they had to import everything else, and it made them interdependent. And that's what the oligarchs wanted, because that allows them to control the population, because as soon as you don't do what they tell you to do, they cut off the imports. They do what they're doing to Russia right now. They blockade them. They say you're not, and they will starve out the people of that country for taking the quote unquote handout at the beginning of the project. Another guy that is mentioned, which we haven't come to, was a partner of Rockefeller's back in the day, and that was a guy by the name of Kaiser. Henry Kaiser, the same Kaiser that we're well aware of, had an automobile line, and we just heard about the cars being flooded and basically overrunning the local car production in Brazil. But Kaiser had a car line that he couldn't sell in America because no one wanted it. And he opened that car line in Brazil. And of course, the Brazilians were not all that happy about it either. But in a lot of cases, because it was a kind of, because Kaiser was big in the iron ore mining as well. He's the one that had all the aluminum mines here in America back in the day. But he was involved in that as well, which I had not read before. So very, very interesting. SR-71.
Thank you, Colonel. You make an interesting point here that I hadn't considered what was going on and some of the stuff that's going on. A prime example of what you're talking about when I think of this is Cuba and their car industry. And what happened when the U.S. went into Cuba? We provided all the technology, we provided the cars, we provided everything else, and then all of a sudden we're persona non grata. Cuba is left to their own devices, and this is exactly why you have some of the oldest cars available on the street in Cuba. They have turned to their own means to try to keep a society going. And that just sort of puts a cap on top of what's going on.
Well,
and I would have thought that by now we would have learned that people will go to their own devices to get what's necessary done. Russia is a prime example of that. You would think our companies would understand that.
Well, they're not interested in that. They're interested in money, and they want the immediate money. And the other thing that I would throw out there too, part of this entire thing, and we talked about it briefly in the book, the exposure to debt. So they want people basically spending, and all of those loan programs to get international harvester machinery down into Brazil. All of the loan programs were processed primarily through Chase National Bank, which of course is a Rockefeller bank. And that was Nelson Rockefeller looking like he was doing great things on the agricultural side and modernizing everything. You see how they can spin everything. Look at all these good deeds we're doing for all those poor people in Brazil, while at the same time, no one's talking about the other hand of the Rockefeller family, namely the Chase Bank, and they're making bank off of all of the loans to these people. And if they don't pay it, they just take their farm. Renee, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. Hey, everyone. Nice to be here with you as always. Just to piggyback on what you were talking about with Rockefeller and the farming, etc. In his book, in Rockefeller's book that you read, the 600, 700 pager, did you ever see him in that region called Minas Gerais in Brazil, where they do all the mining? And did you come across that.
Well, he traveled down there all the time. He did
Right.
spend quite a bit of time down there. I don't know if he traveled to that exact location.
Right.
But back when he was, what's the name of that? Hold on just a second. I'll pull it up here. When he was a part of the Asian, what is that? Not Asian, sorry. I just had it. When he was part of the Inter-American Affairs Office under FDR, he traveled down there extensively. As a matter of fact, he went down there. The name of that book is Thy Will Be Done, as all along mentioned. He went down there and got sick one time from some, tropical disease. So I do know he traveled down there a lot.
Right, and to connect some dots here, Kubitschek and Niemeyer, who were essential characters in the creation of Brasilia, which is now the capital. That region was very sparse prior because it's
Correct.
red clay,
Correct.
and they can't really farm there. But Kubitschek, when he was president, helped in developing in the creation of Brasilia, which was done in record time of like the city, which is kind of in the Midwest center. It is in the state of Goiás, which is next to Minas Gerais. And that area is now inundated, being stuck in the big agro loop of you have to buy the seed, you have to buy the equipment, John Deere, you have to buy this and that, and it's majority corn, soybean, stuff like this. They get a lot of subsidies, and the farmers in that region get rich, but they can't get out of the loop and be free, independent farmers, because they're captured by that whole system. And not only producing those type of crops, but Brazil is very big in the seed oil biofuel industry. They are not a very industrialized nation. Sorry for the background noise, but the whole Cargill and Louis Dreyfus and all these big ag companies that are connected with Europe and the United States, there are 3 or 4 of them that are really big in the biofuel production and the oil seed production from these crops as well, which we sell all around the world, and they toss in a majority of our food and processed food and everything that so it's all interconnected.
And that exact same thing happened in Argentina. And of course, you can't fail to mention Monsanto, because Monsanto, with the whole seed and the Roundup, basically like an Agent Orange thing, where the hybrid seeds are created to specifically not be affected by the herbicides that they use. And they're almost, in the one book that I read about this actually described it as like a napalm, Agent Orange type of material that they use crop dusting aircraft, which then puts it in the air and it goes around to surrounding neighbors that they have deformed babies, they have cancer, they have all kinds of health maladies as a result of this. But can you imagine you're growing something that can survive napalm air misting, and you're calling it food, whether it be soy product or corn or whatever. But as you pointed out, a lot of that product is then later used in the quote unquote climate change green things of fuel, but at the same time, they're producing food with those same types of farming practices. It's crazy when you start doing the research into that entire thing. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, what you just said of the kind of intermediary commodities processing role that U.S. agribusiness and also European agribusiness, basically international agribusiness cartels, wanted to do in accentuate in Brazil. It reminds me of a book, Colonel, that I know you've read called Coup in Dallas, where he mentions what was called the Great Salad Oil commodity scandal of 1963, which was a story that broke on the Wall Street Journal on page 1 on November 22nd, 1963. And that actually won a Pulitzer Prize. And, the whole question of commodities and how the trends going on in 61, 62, 63, and from earlier versus how that changed after the JFK assassination is, to me, an intriguing one. And I might be kind of connecting dots that shouldn't be connected here, but there was also, the question of during JFK's administration where he used the bully pulpit as president to shine a light on what had been basically a massive commodities rigging scandal involving the Pentagon, where the Pentagon was storing all these commodities for purposes of war production and emergency war production. And there was journalism in the Washington Post, in particular by Larry Stern, a guy I know I've mentioned repeatedly, who, Sterling Seagrave said he was murdered by the CIA. Literally, he said that later on in 1980. But Larry Stern has several articles about the commodities rigging going on in the Pentagon with high mucky mucks and including folks like we know that Whitney was heavily involved in the nickel business and that sort of commodities, and it's commodities before and after the JFK assassination, tendencies that were favored by the internationalists versus impediments to said internationalist commodity harmony. It is kind of, I think, worth looking at. I don't think any professor is going to get paid to do any of that sort of compare and contrast anytime soon, though.
Right. I agree. I also forgot to, I didn't forget, but it's not in the book about the rubber industry in Brazil. That's huge too. And that's where you get into the, it was because the rubber production was more in the indigenous Indian occupied, the native Indians down there territory, where you got the predators posing as Protestant missionaries going into the area to kind of scout out not just the mining part of it, but where the soil was going to produce the most rubber trees, and to be able to cultivate that. And of course, that's Goodyear, and all of the other U.S. oligarchs associated with that industry as well. So it's crazy. Anyway, anybody got anything else? If not, we're going to call it a day, and I will be back tomorrow at 4:00. See you guys then. Okay, guys, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Let's see. There are, I'm going to figure out how to do these sponsorship things that are over here on Rumble, so that we can generate more activity to our page over here. I just haven't figured out how to do it. There is things that you can read on air, and I'm not sure how they work, but I am going to start doing one at the end of each of these shows as soon as I figure out how to do them. And I just will appreciate you guys's patience as I learn how to do that, because that will take a little bit of pressure off of us by doing it. So when I figure that out, I will be reading, and it's generally just kind of as an advertisement for Rumble itself. But it does move up if you read one of them at the end of the show. It increases your visibility in their algorithms. So I'm going to figure out how to do that. Anyway, thanks for being here, everyone. I appreciate it, and I will see you tomorrow.